It's something that you could laugh about if it was not something that is very concerning when you see that type of propaganda at work in a country like Georgia. Propaganda that is clearly completely in line with what the Russians are portraying on their side.
Hello, this is Martin Fernusek from the Kyiv Independent, reporting here from the Warsaw Security Forum. We will be talking to top European officials to discuss Western support for Ukraine and major security challenges facing NATO. Madam President, Georgia's ruling party has recently passed foreign agents law and anti-LGBT legislation that resembles Russian legislation. Why did the ruling party push forward this legislation despite protests at home and protests from Western partners?
Well, that's something you have to ask them, not me. I've been opposing this law, as did the vast majority of the Georgian population, twice. Once last year on the streets, another time this year on the streets. I put my veto on this law. It has now gone also to the Constitutional Court to no effect, because the Constitutional Court is delaying its appreciation of this, the constitutionality of this law. But why is a question that has to be answered by those that took this decision. What we can say from outside is that this looks very much like the modus operandi of the Russians when they were trying to coerce and restrain their civil society. That's how they started, to first try to take control over the non-governmental organizations, put pressure on them, and that's what's happening today. And it is even more of a concern in Georgia because that is happening on the eve of elections, when those organizations have an important role to play in terms of monitoring the elections and being very much involved in this pre-electoral campaign.
A decade ago, Georgia was seen as the country most prepared for EU accession, both in terms of rule of law and legislation. Now it is lagging behind and the process is effectively frozen. How was this development possible?
Well, it has come as a development of the positions taken by the authorities that have really lagged behind in their implementation of the first 12 recommendations that were given by the European Union under different pretexts. And then lastly, the 9 recommendations, which despite that we got the status of candidate that was granted to Georgia. That was received, and that's a very important sign. It was received with enthusiasm by the whole population without any distinction between who the people were supporting or not supporting. So it really reflects the sense of the population as a whole. And after that started even an intensification of the anti-European rhetoric, anti-American rhetoric, and very aggressive, accusing our partners, Europeans and Americans, of wanting to open a second front in Georgia. When one knows what the European Union is about, why it was created, and how difficult it is for European countries to think about war, even about supporting Ukraine. It has taken time for them. It's something that you could laugh about if it was not something that is very concerning when you see that type of propaganda at work in a country like Georgia, and the propaganda that is clearly completely in line with what the Russians are portraying on their side.
Would you say that Moscow is now calling the shots in Tbilisi?
Well, it's very difficult to say whether they're calling the shots or whether the ruling party is trying to please the Russians on its own initiative, but it doesn't really matter. That's something that you cannot know from outside. What is important is this parallelism, this similarity that says a lot about the direction in which the ruling party is going, and which I'm convinced will be overrun in the coming elections, because that's not what the Georgian people, having 2 territories occupied, can want for its own future.
So do you think that the upcoming parliamentary elections will decide Georgia's future?
Of course, first of all, it's going to be a quasi-referendum because that's the way it's seen by the population, that we are choosing now whether we go back to our European path or whether we accept and defer to the Russian indirect pressure. And that's the way the Georgian population is preparing for these elections. That's the way in which the political forces are preparing themselves. And there is by now common ground and platform for the four pro-European opposition parties. And I think that we are going in good condition towards these elections.
What do you think about Mr. Ivanishvili's statement that Georgia carries the blame for the war in 2008 and that it should apologize?
Well, all of that has been, it's not one declaration, it's a set of all the last declarations and rhetoric that goes in one direction. It is to, what I said, to please Russia and to attack our friends and partners. So that is the image in general that is very preoccupying in Georgia. And that is what the Georgian population sees and doesn't understand, and I'm sure doesn't share.
There has been signs of deterioration of relations between Ukraine and Georgia. Georgian Dream has even used footage of war in its campaign ads. How would you describe the current state of relations between Ukraine and Georgia?
Well, I would not describe that as relations between Ukraine and Georgia. I would describe that as relations between Ukraine and the ruling party of Georgia. That does not describe the state of mind of the Georgian population, which was upset in a very brutal way by this campaign that was launched by the ruling party that was putting in contrast the war in Ukraine and the peace supposedly in Georgia. Nobody liked it, and they had to withdraw some of these videos. And I think that the state of relations between Georgia and Ukraine is better described and seen on the streets of Tbilisi, where you see Ukrainian flags almost everywhere, and the way in which Ukrainians are received by the Georgian population. So I'm quite optimistic about the future of our relations after